Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall podcast featuring Kate Riga. Today, we were talking about before the episode, sort of, what are we going to talk about today? And it's funny because in a way, there's a ton of news, and each morsel of news is about sort of a fraying of support for the president, a fraying of support for ICE, a fraying of support for the wilding sprees we see in different communities around the United States, especially ICE wilding sprees, especially in Minneapolis. We have votes that aren't going their way, blah 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 blah. So we're gonna kind of dip into that because we 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 have this kind of paradoxical news environment where there's a lot going on and it's sort of hard to see the common thread, but there is a common thread, which is a continuing ebbing of public support for the president, for ICE, for the White House, and you're seeing that come up in different ways, and it's not always 100% obvious how the thread connects. What we saw, I believe it was yesterday that he announced this. Tom Homan, he announced that they are in fact wrapping up the entire operation in Minneapolis. Clearly, they've decided it's just not. There's no more political juice that is going to be drawn out of Minneapolis for them. Set aside, how they were doing in deporting people, which has never really been the object here. Whatever else we can say about these ICE wilding sprees, they're not the most efficient way to run up your deportation numbers. They're just not. And it is a performative sort of spectacle, and they've decided that there's no more good to come out of it for them. One thing I wanted to mention here, there was a poll that I saw, I don't know, in the first week after Alex Pretty was shot, and as you'd expect, it showed the ongoing it showed the ongoing uh, uh, you know bad press. It sort of sounds kind of crude to put it that way. Bad press for ICE and these wilding sprees. But the key was that it was the first time they lost a lot of Republicans on one of these on one of these questions, on Alex Pretty's shooting, on what ICE is doing in Minneapolis, whether it's justified. A big chunk of Republicans were saying no, and that's clearly what prompted that turnabout, firing Greg Bavino or whatever they did to him, because that is the one thing they cannot allow. As long as they have absolute or near absolute Republican support, in a sense, they don't care if he's down at 40%, as long as they have that. But if that starts to fray, everything can kind of pull apart. There was one more data point I wanted to mention before I turn it over to Kate. There's been a series of, we've seen all these ICE related indictments of protesters, of, kind of people who are presented as sort of feral immigrants. And they're usually there are these very outlandish claims. Three immigrants ambushed an ICE officer and he had to shoot him, and all this kind of stuff. So there's one of these cases that it often gets talked to in the news. It's a shovel attack. I guess one of these immigrants allegedly used a shovel to attack an ICE agent. The DOJ dropped charges in that case yesterday, and they had this line in there that said, "This is a quote: Newly discovered evidence in this matter is materially inconsistent with the allegations in the complaint affidavit." So what that means is we have new evidence that shows that what we accuse these people of never happened. I mean, materially inconsistent. That's not like, oh, we've got to turn this over to the defense because, arguably it helps the defense. It basically means what we accuse them of could not have happened because of this evidence we have found. And the prosecutors go in and ask for the charges to be withdrawn with prejudice. We've seen a lot of these cases collapse. This is one of the more intense versions of a collapse. So, in a lot of ways, we see again power ebbing, the storyline shifting. So we're going to kind of dip into a number of those today, and then get into some other topics. So, co-host Kate, what are some other of these topics we're looking at today?
So yesterday, Thursday, we're recording on a weird day this week. The judge ruled in favor of Mark Kelly in this situation where Pete Hegseth is trying to, uh, you know, downgrade his rank and affect his retirement benefits. This all stems from a video that Kelly did with 5 other lawmakers around the time of the National Guard deportations and the Venezuelan boat strikes. Basically, just advising members of the military that you're not allowed to follow illegal orders, right? That's something that you can be punished for later. Um, and really, it is kind of like stunning to me the degree to which it got stuck in their craw. Like there is something really inflammatory to them about the idea that the military is not, you know, not just kind of at Trump's beck and call, but I think fanatically pro MAGA itself. Um, but they've been going after Kelly since then. Him being retired military kind of gives a backdoor to go after him using military courts instead of civilian ones. And, everybody kind of thinks he might run for president. So that makes him low hanging fruit of these six. And you know, kudos to Kelly. He sued. He didn't wait to go through this kind of farcical arbitration process, right? Where Hegseth ordered the Secretary of the Navy to do this. It was clearly going to be a foregone conclusion. He took it right to court, and the judge, he's a colorful guy to begin with. He's quite old. He's a George Bush appointee. I've been in his courtroom a few times before, but he just wrote this really kind of impassioned ruling, saying, you know, this is outrageous. Can you imagine what this country would be like if we stifled the free speech rights of not just retired military, but retired military who sit in Congress? How could that possibly work? So it was a pretty big, resounding win for Kelly. Hegseth was like, we're going to appeal immediately, blah, blah, blah. But it was a good data point in the category of, fighting Trump always reaps better rewards than just rolling over and taking it.
Yeah, this is a case where, I mean, to that point, there's there's a broader point here, and this is something that is coming up in a lot of these topics we're going to discuss. That what the government generally has almost, it's technically not an absolute authority, but in practice, the government can open an investigation of anyone, right? There's almost literally um, uh, uh, no bar on that at all. And as we know, opening an investigation, you got to hire lawyers, so that's a punishment almost in itself, right? That the government can sort of get you billing lawyers, can get bad headlines for you, can put the fear of criminal punishment over you. That is a big thing in itself. It can, in most cases, kind of bring indictments of you for whenever it wants. We've seen the limits of that when they go into grand juries and they get rejected in grand juries, or a judge rejects an effort. But in most cases, they can indict you if they want to indict you, which then you're charged with a federal crime, and that is another level of thing. But you have these kind of understructure of political authority in the US, which is grand juries, which is trial juries. And that's where that sort of absolute authority slows down, right? Where you can't necessarily get something through a grand jury. And we're going to talk about an instance of that in a moment. You can't necessarily get things through a trial jury. So and so they're coming up against these are things that exist. They are in the U.S. Constitution, but the U.S. Constitution didn't create the idea of a jury or a grand jury. It guarantees our right to it. So there's these. It's this it's this structure of what amounts to popular sovereignty of democratic power that is built into our system. And the reason I raise that here is that in these agency processes, did Mark Kelly want to sit around and let go through the drip 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 of a rigged process in which it's Pete Hegseth conferring with the people who work for Pete Hegseth about what should happen to Mark Kelly? And as you said, he said, "No, I'm gonna go right to the courts. I'm not gonna wait. I'm gonna be proactive." And you see an example of what they're they're as corrupted as the federal judiciary is. There's still some juice there. There's still some pushback there.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, the jury comes into it because we found out that on Tuesday, the Trump administration tried to bring an indictment against Kelly and the other five in the video, and a jury in Washington D.C. wouldn't bring the indictment against him. And it's funny because we've seen this so many times in the Trump administration, prominently with anti ICE protesters, connecting to what you talked about in the monologue, that it almost has stopped feeling strange when it happens. But it's so bizarre for prosecutors to not be able to secure an indictment. Like that's just so
It's
rare.
unheard of.
You
It's unheard of.
you have that old, goofy thing of you can indict a ham sandwich, blah blah blah. It's like it really is a profound rebellion from normal people for a jury of, completely randomly selected people to say, no, we're not doing this. Like you can use all the lawyer jargon and kind of try to dress up these totally silly cases, but we're not doing it. And I guess Alyssa Slotkin, who's one of these six, told reporters yesterday that they hear they're going to try again. So I don't know what that'll look like exactly, but it's pretty telling that they need multiple bites at the apple, hoping that they get a jury composed of people who are a little more credulous.
It's funny that one detail that came out of this is that they didn't just fail to get the grand jury to vote for it. They apparently, and this is there's pretty I mean, obviously these numbers are not officially released. They all it comes out through reporting, but there seems to be some pretty solid reporting on this. They failed to get a single member of that grand jury to vote for an indictment. Now, I think I saw I believe I saw yesterday in an article I was reading about this that last year, or I guess in 2024, there had been something like 160,000 federal indictments, and I believe 5 times they had gotten, failed to get charges through a grand jury. Put an asterisk by that number. I'm going from memory, but it's something I just read yesterday. It just sort of it just sort of underlines the absolute rarity of this. And the other point to remember is that when you have a batting average like that, it's partly because it's not just because grand juries are so easy. It's that you're not going to bring the case unless you are basically certain that at the grand jury level you're gonna get it, because the grand jury isn't looking at reasonable doubt. They're looking at a very low standard. Like, is there enough here to even bring charges? Um, so and what does that tell us? It tells us that the prosecutors in these cases are either, I mean, I believe again I saw that Gene Pirro had brought in a kind of literally a part-time lawyer, like part-time, like someone who runs a nail salon but also has a law degree, as they're kind of doing field commissions of prosecutors. So this is someone who is barely a lawyer. But in a lot of these cases, it's because the prosecutors are not able to make the judgment. Do we have a case here that we could even get past a grand jury? They're being told by the political people at the top, we want you to bring this case. That changes the equation. I suspect in a number of these cases, the prosecutors, to the extent that they are actually real prosecutors, are going to these grand juries almost, maybe they're not, they have their own ethical norms that they have to operate in, but they may know they're going to get rejected, and that's almost kind of takes them off the hook in a way, because if they're rejected, it's not, they're not refusing, they don't have to resign, they can just go in there, present the evidence, and let a grand jury say no.
Well, bringing in this, part-time lawyer also kind of reminds me, I think it was last week that this quote from a DOJ prosecutor kind of went viral where mid-court hearing, she was just like, "This job sucks. I hate it. Hold me in contempt so I can sleep for 24 hours." Like there's a reason that some of the biggest exoduses post Doge have been from DOJ prosecutors, right? And in a lot of cases, it's tied to their conscience, right? Like they don't want to bring charges out of, vengeance against James Comey or whatever. So they walk, and we've had a whole bunch of waves of stuff like that. But as you kind of say, now everyone who's left has, first of all, an enormous workload because there's no discernment about where to kind of aim the might of the government. So like you say, they're not waiting for quality cases, they're just using this as a cudgel kind of whenever anyone dares to cross them. And then combine that with, in these huge deportation sweeps, now because of the Supreme Court, everyone files individual habeas petitions, and so you have a ton of cases coming out of that, kind of part of the legal system as well. So put all that together, and it's just an enormous caseload, shitty, weak cases, and federal judges who are getting increasingly fed up with having shitty, weak cases in front of them, and prosecutors who don't know the cases that well. And, not that we have to shed a lot of tears for DOJ prosecutors, but it doesn't exactly seem like that enjoyable of a job right now.
Well, there was also, and this is probably part of what you're referring to. There was a ruling. I believe it was yesterday. Possibly, I read it yesterday, and it was the day before. But in the last like 36 hours, where basically the government's position was, look, we arrested so many people in these sweeps, we didn't have the manpower to like give everybody their due process rights, or bring everybody in on the petitions they may have brought. And the federal judge says it doesn't work that way. Just because you arrested more people that you could like provide due process for, or just hearings for, that's on you. You should have arrested fewer people, or you should have had more lawyers around, but just like that's not how it works. And so you do have this combination of judges, too many DOJ lawyers having left, very poor morale, ICE stepping up the pace of the mass arrests, and meanwhile judges who are just less and less patient. And there actually was another federal judge who issued a ruling earlier this week that basically said our standard process has always been, we start with the assumption that the government is telling us the truth. That's not the final word, but that's what we default to, and we can't default to that anymore because you guys are lying to us all the time. So we have to assume that kind of put the government of the United States in the same bucket as the criminal defendant, where the criminal defendant is presumed innocent, but we don't, as a general matter, we don't assume their factual, the person under indictment is, that all of their factual claims are true. We want to see some evidence, and now the U.S. government is in that same position.
So let's kind of shift from the courts over to Congress, where signs of Trump's declining power are also manifesting. And one way that's happened is yesterday, the House voted on this mostly symbolic kind of resolution expressing disapproval of the Canadian tariffs in particular. And it passed because 6 Republicans joined with all the Democrats minus Jared Golden. So, kind of, it's interesting to me because you think of like where are the very few venues where particularly House Republicans have rebelled against Trump. More or less, it's like the Epstein files and tariffs, right? Which is kind of indicative, I think, because Epstein files, obviously, and we've talked about this a bit before, but was such a kind of cornerstone of the MAGA worldview while Trump was running again, right? This whole you can't just not vote for Democrats because you don't like their policy, but you can't vote for them because they are pedophiles and they are running a child sex ring, and that makes it existential. Um, and on the tariffs, it's a little bit different because there you don't have Trump, more or less kind of abandoning a campaign promise. You have a topic that is an audience of one. Nobody cares about tariffs. Nobody likes tariffs except for Trump.
Yeah, I think, this is, I remember back to 2006, which was another time that was the second, uh, uh, well, I guess this is Trump's second term, but there are things that happen when a president is losing his ability to command his partisans, and you start seeing votes going their way, going against them. They can't hold their people in line in Congress, and we are seeing more and more of that. We are also seeing a growing number of Republicans in the House saying they're not running again. This is what happens when a party is anticipating not just a hard midterm, but like a bloodbath, maybe. And I do think we have continually it's such there's such a funny thing in the dynamics of the politics around the Trump presidency that the the public conversation, as much as it's not that there are not a lack of Trump opposition voices in the public conversation, but they understate just how bad a position Trump is in politically, public opinion wise. There was a there was a poll I saw from I think it may have been like Rasmussen or something like that, kind of, where's Trump on immigration, and it was like 60-40 against him, which is like stunning, right? um you see all of these evidence points of a terrible political position for the president looking towards the 2026 midterms, and yet the public conversation kind of remains, well, there's some things that are bad for Democrats, some things that are bad for Republicans, and it's almost like there's something in the press ecosystem that you want to keep it sort of you want to keep it appearing like things are kind of about equal politically, because otherwise it's hard to know what to talk about, right? If it's like the Republicans are doomed always, that's you don't really know what to say. In any case, I continue to think that uh, there's a level of opposition growing to growing to Trump that the press conversation does not uh, give doesn't sufficiently capture. And you see it in things like these, again, when a grand jury refuses a single, no single member of a grand jury will go along with something a prosecutor says, like in the case of these 6 lawmakers. We think of that as in the legal bucket, but it's not really. That's in the public opinion bucket. right? That is absolutely informed by the fact that people are seeing everything that is going on with ICE. They're seeing the attempt to prosecute enemies and stuff, and they don't like it. And when you convene a grand jury, you're picking from that pool, and you get results like that, and you just see that ebbing of power. Uh, you see it across the board.
The thing that I kind of wonder about with, these decreasing markers of Trump's popularity, the seeming, barring some catastrophe, it seems like the 26 midterms are going to be either good or great for Democrats.
Hmm.
Um, does that just leave us in a place, though, where Democrats change nothing in their behavior or their temperament? Like, we've seen kind of little flirtations with being more pugnacious, usually by individual members. Like, congressional leadership has not changed that much. I mean, you can point to maybe a willingness to shut down as inching in that direction,
Hmm.
but then they let the 7 people fold. It's generally kind of like more of the same of what we've seen before. Not a ton of innovation in the messaging space, whatever. I'm What do you think about that?
Well, do you mean like do you mean what would happen after, if we assume there might, if they have big wins, they come into the majority in early 2027, what do they do then? Or do you mean like for the next year, is that gonna shift?
Yeah, no, I'm thinking post midterms, because to me, like, kind of what I see as most likely is, let's just say they win the House. Let's say they
Right.
don't win the Senate, just to kind of simplify things.
Yep. Yep.
What seems most likely to me is we have some, like, rigorous oversight in the House, but it's mostly coming from, like, Jamie Raskin, or these,
Right.
like,
Right. Right.
individual members who are kind of willing to don boxing gloves, and
Hmm.
no greater top down kind of, "We won the House. Here's our project 2027. Here's a day by day how we're gonna attract and keep attention. What kind of pieces of the Trump catastrophe are we going to, use our subpoena power and
Hmm.
our theatrical power to focus on. Here's who we're going to drag in front of us, and if they don't come, we are, doing contempt immediately." Like that, let's say even a January 6th scale kind of production, that
Hmm.
seems like
Hmm.
very remote to me.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think that when we think back to what happened in the second after 2018, that Democrats were very excited. They were going to have all this power to investigate and subpoena and stuff like that, and impeach. And obviously, Trump was impeached twice. And yet, as we learned, there's not that much you can do from the House. Yeah, you remember the whole thing about, well, are they going to be able to get his taxes? Well, they can just do it, but they didn't just do it. And as we also learned, sure, you can impeach the president, and you can have the good time of a trial in the Senate. But I do think we need to everybody needs to be clear that in addition to having a much stronger hand in like budget negotiations and stuff like that, especially um, if the Democrats take control of the Senate, that especially this version of the Trump administration, you can do lots of oversight, but we need to look clearly at the fact that total noncompliance puts real limits on what oversight can be. Um, it certainly means that you need to go to court on day one of anything. You're not going through these like you're not playing it out in some way of normal procedure, or trying to play to the judges about that you're going by the book. You have to do that. Um, and you have to be ready for lots of shutdowns and stuff like that. I mean, to answer your question, Kate, I do think that this is a lot of what happens there is going to be determined by the 2026 election. because you have a lot of Democratic incumbents who are going to be um, who need to prove their bona fides in trying to get reelected, trying to stave off primaries. You're going to have people who are Democrats who are newly elected, who are going to come in demanding something different. So that, I think, is whether you are going to see something dramatically different is going to come down to um, commitments that reps and senators made on the campaign trail. And whether that comes down to new leadership, who knows? But if let's just say what is still it's not a long shot anymore, but it's tough if Democrats take over the Senate, and let's say it's like by a long shot, it's a 52 seat majority. Well, those new senators are going to come in demanding something very different, and they will potentially have a lot of sway. So I don't know. It's going to be determined a lot by, again, what happens on the campaign trail in 2026. And the other thing to keep in mind is that in early 2027, really everything is going to be moving towards the 2028 presidential, and those candidates and the demands they're making are gonna also play in a lot. But to your basic question, good question. And I think it's up to Democratic voters, really.
I was thinking about this because I was covering the hearings with the ICE and Customs and Border Patrol chiefs this week. They had one in the House on Tuesday, one in the Senate on Thursday. And these were called right in the kind of apex of the public outcry after Alex Preddy was killed. Obviously, these are both Republican chairs. And the House hearing in particular was so bad that I was just kind of sitting there the whole time like, this is such a completely useless exercise. And what's kind of irritating about it is, again, bringing it back to January 6th, like we have a model of a hearing that can be quite buzzy and can attract a lot of coverage, and that is kind of crafted for social media and TV. And it's not a complicated formula, because all that January 6th had was a coordination between the people who are asking the questions, the members who are asking the questions, and B, tons of video footage, including a lot of new video footage. And that the new video footage is probably the hardest part to replicate in a more kind of anodyne hearing. But when I was at this House hearing, it's like, it's how they always go. A member will come in when their staff texts them that it's their turn to ask their questions. They'll ask their questions slash kind of monologue for those 5 minutes. Like, it's really easy for witnesses to filibuster because the time is so short. So a lot of them don't even ask questions. They just kind of like hurl stuff at the witnesses and try to sound like really angry for a few minutes. And then
Hmm.
their time is up. They gather up their papers, they leave. Each of these mini monologues is completely disconnected from the others. They're not listening to what the others are saying. So there's like tons of repetition. There's almost never any actual effort to get any information from these people, which my editor John Light kind of brought up as maybe that's a better way to do it. Like, come in with one question that you actually want to know and just like keep it in your teeth, don't drop it until you get kind of somewhere on it. But so like that's what the Democrats are doing, and then Republicans are largely just kind of, glazing ice the whole time. So it's just this enormous waste of time. And then the Senate version, though, was markedly better, but that's because it had one of the January 6th hallmarks. Like Rand Paul, who's kind of interesting in this case to begin with, because I wrote an article yesterday about how his like fair weather libertarianism is rearing its head in his opposition to ICE. But, he and Gary Peters, who, these are not people who are kind of known for their telegenic magnetism, but they open with a frame by frame video of the Preddy killing, and they just kind of play it inch by inch and ask the witnesses, like, is this standard operating procedure? Like, is it really normal to beat someone with a pepper spray can? Is that what you're supposed to do? Like, he clearly has his hands up. He has no weapon in his hands, blah, 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 and they just go kind of piece by piece. And it's just so much more like visually stimulating than just these members reading from a paper in front of them. That alone just makes it like much more compelling, in addition to the little quirk here of there being some bipartisan pushback on on a topic that Trump has insisted on full-throated support.
Hmm.
So I'm just I it'll be interesting to see, if Democrats do take the House, if they take any lessons from what we've seen have worked before, because there have been some like false starts where it's kind of like, okay, big oversight, right? Big gavel, like things are going to change. And then they just put no effort or creativity into these hearings at all. So as you're talking about, not only do they not work as an enforcement mechanism, which I agree you're going to run into issues with like non-compliance, and enforcing contempt charges takes forever, and I don't know if they'll have the stomach to kind of like pull a Trump and say, okay, fine, we're going to go sift through your mortgage papers and bring you to court on owning a vacation home or something.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
as a messaging theatrical venue, there are definitely ways to make at least the spectacle more useful, that as of now they're just not even kind of attempting to do.
Yeah, I think one part of this is that it's important for Democrats and Democratic activists, and activist has, um, I don't know, we need a better word than activist, because at some level, and that's not that activist is a bad word. I think of activists as people who are kind of involved in specific organizations, are going to protest, or that's, I think of activists in those terms. I'm just talking about people who are very committed political people, committed partisans. We need a language for what Kate is talking about. That, are you running coordinated hearings? Because, as Kate says, whether in a public education sense, or a actually getting new information sense, just having kind of semi-distracted members of the House, I guess, sort of making statements kind of for video for YouTube, hoping, but it's, they're fairly low energy state. I mean, to the extent that you were up there kind of getting angry and kind of, reading bullet points, um, that is an action of the C-SPAN social media era, right? Because without that, no one cares. No one cares how angry you look or stuff like that. That if you are going to be operating in that era, you need to have that kind of coordination, where you are going to, as Kate was saying, um, uh, let's look at the video, and have the the head of ICE, the head of Customs and Border Protection, react to the video. Or you can think of, I mean, one of the big things that I think about is that there was something I read about this morning. It was actually, I think it was an article in the Wall Street Journal from a few days ago. um, every son of a principal in the Trump administration is making hundreds of millions, or in some cases billions of dollars, on crypto scams. Witkoff's son, Trump's sons. Uh, there are so many examples. Lutnick's sons. They're all doing this, and it is so belief defying. You want to kind of just dig into that. There's so much of it. It has been hard for it. I think it's kind of hard for the public to even keep track of it. It's so pervasive now. There's such a total non-enforcement of anything, that, to a great extent, if you're a member of the public, you only know something's wrong when there's an investigation, because finance is, yeah, I mean this in a few different ways. It's kind of difficult for the public to easily distinguish between what is normal, weird financial transactions that don't kind of make sense in common sense terms, to what is criminal. Um, so there's just lots of things like that. But again, I think that and if you are someone out there who's interested in politics and an activist, a committed political person, think about what is the tagline for what we're talking about. Are you going to run coordinated hearings? And if you're not, maybe you shouldn't. Maybe you shouldn't be the chairman, because these one of the things we see so often is a lot of people. This is kind of, we see this with Senate brain in the Senate. There is still this sense of like, okay, there's politics, but then this is running a hearing. Well, no, there's not. Those things are all about those are all engagements with public opinion, and if you don't grasp that, you shouldn't be running a hearing. And there are also, to the extent that chairs of committees, maybe Democratic chairman in the next Congress possibly, to the extent that you have a member of the House or the Senate who you can see is not working with the coordinated plan, is up there just kind of giving their little speech, that should be embarrassing. That should be something that people call them out, and you don't want to do, because it's sort of damaging to your brand. But I totally agree. You see a lot of it, and it's useless, because to the extent, as Kate was saying, to the extent uh, to the extent that each person's 2 minutes is uncoordinated, it's super easy for whoever's on the stand just to go like, yep, 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 got it. I'm gonna run the clock out on you, and we'll go to the next person, and we'll sort of start the whole process again, and I'll do the whole thing again.
Yeah, it's almost reminiscent of, how the White House press corps will never ever like back each other up. Like Trump will filibuster on one kind of good, valid question, and then the next reporter will move on to whatever they want to talk about. Whereas if they actually worked in concert, not that necessarily questioning Trump is ever very productive, but at least you could prolong the discomfort, right? Like underscore the fact that he really doesn't want to answer this question. Um, yeah. So I don't know. It's interesting. And I've like asked aides before, like, why doesn't this happen all the time? Like, why at the very least aren't you guys working off like a Google Doc and being like,
Hmm.
I'll take this area and I'll take this area kind of thing. And it's like such a disappointing answer. It's just kind of like laziness. Like that would require more effort than it does at present. So people don't want to kind of undertake doing the homework, that doing a group project, versus kind of
Yeah.
like prepping their stuff the morning before the hearing or whatever.
Well, even what you described, and look, members of Congress do have a lot of things they're doing, right? They're meeting. I mean, aside from things like fundraising that maybe we wish they weren't doing, but they're meeting with constituents. They have, there's other committee work happening at the same time. There's a vote, blah 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 blah. But to the extent what you describe as sort of like, when it's their turn, their staffers text them and they come over. Well, that's a little disappointing. A lot of people, if this is really that important, maybe actually show up for the hearing, right? And kind of and listen to the whole thing. But there is, and you see that particularly in the Senate, but there often is with maybe particularly people who've been up there for a long time, that you know I I got bigger fish to fry than you ordinary people may know about. I got a lot going on, so all my attention can't be on this one thing. Voters should be a little less sympathetic to that. I want as a voter, um, I want you to be jammed up about this as I am, maybe more, because you want the job, right? Like it's literally it's your job. I'm doing my job. Everybody else has a day job. We gave you this job to make it your day job. And so if 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 you can't get quite as exercised about it as your constituents are, maybe you need to be in a different line of work.
I mean, and this is also connected to like the seniority problems in the Democratic caucus, right? The whole kind of whoever's been there the longest usually gets the gavel, or at least gets to be ranking member. And I mean, we've seen the ramifications of that a lot. It's the whole Jerry Connolly AOC thing. You have
Mm-hmm.
someone made the chair who doesn't have any interest in kind of changing the way things are done or the way messaging is done, because they don't really have any talent for it.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
why
Mm-hmm.
would they kind of want to upset the apple cart? So that's part of the equation as well.
I think one just a final point on this, and we're going to briefly discuss another topic. Is maybe this is a way that ordinary voters, ordinary partisans can communicate this to their representatives. Is I want to see you taking this as seriously as you seem to take it in the fundraising emails I get, because in the fundraising emails, man, it's a fucking crisis. It's like this is our last chance, and I need to see you in that mode when I when I see you as part of a hearing, right? I need to see you as worked up as you are in the fundraising emails, because that is, and that definitely is a disconnect I think we see through our politics, and it demoralizes people, and people, it demoralizes people, and it should demoralize people, because that delta, that disconnect is hard to see. So we're going to briefly switch to a topic that I've written about a few times in the last week, and that is basically the authoritarian international. That we have Trumpism in the U.S., but we know that Trump is sort of in deep with the Gulf princes. He's in deep, whatever you think of what happened in 2016. He's got a very tight relationship with Russia. Kind of with when Bolsonaro was in power in Brazil. That kind of that authoritarian international, and the way that it is increasingly tied together with these relationships between the Trump family and people, or and kind of people around the Trump family, and Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. They all seem to use the sort of the same security and hacking technology from, often pains me as it is to say, Israeli private sector intelligence companies, um, and that we need to be, whatever happens in a U.S. election, there is that there is that global force which wants authoritarianism in national governments. And one of the most interesting things about, from Trump 1 to Trump 2, is the way that, I mean, we've all seen what's happened in the tech world, that the tech oligarchs basically have moved strongly in the Trump sort of authoritarian direction. But it's really kind of all the billionaires in general, who in the past, okay, maybe they're, maybe some of them are big Republican donors, but often, I don't know, weren't quite as clearly in that camp as they were. Kate, how much of this do you think has sort of seeped into the public consciousness in this country? Mass consciousness, these international relationships, the fact that there's an international Trumpism, there's an international authoritarian movement that people in the U.S. who want to kind of save this country need to keep in mind as an adversary that goes beyond Trump.
Like 0%, I'd
I think
say.
that's the answer. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I mean, I guess. I think that is the answer. There's very little public perception of it. I think the to the degree it has, it is almost entirely about the tech billionaires in the U.S. Like, I think there's a decent amount of public
Mhm.
awareness about the role of Elon Musk, and to an extent about the Jeff Bezoses and the Mark Zuckerbergs and stuff like that, right? I mean,
Yeah, I
that's
mean,
kind of
there's a fixation on, like, the great men, the great American men, right? Like, and sometimes that manifests as here is Steve Jobs', daily schedule. Like, here's how they exercise. Like,
hmm
here's why they're
hmm
so smart and special. And I think that kind of just ups their salience for when they've gotten so kind of overtly political or
right,
willing to be seen engaging in politics in a way that before would have been kind of much more behind closed doors.
right.
But I don't I just really think Americans are not primed to think about the global world order. I think some of
hmm
that stems from the obnoxious kind of American supremacy stuff that, like, you don't
hmm
really have to worry about anyone else. But
right.
also, I mean, look at what happened in the Washington Post, right? What's like kind of the first thing on the cutting board? Any kind of foreign news. It's expensive, it's hard to do. You
hmm
need really, really intense kind of subject matter knowledge and historical knowledge to be able to contextualize things properly, which is, difficult. Um, I don't know. And it's, if you think about kind of our current media landscape, I guess it's just easier for me to see someone using the clips of Pam Bondi fighting with Congress members and getting that to be salient for even
hmm
people who aren't
hmm
politically inclined versus
hmm
like, here's the United States complicated history with Venezuela,
Right, 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 right. Yeah, no, I think the answer is that it has been difficult for the Trump opposition to get Trump on the public radar.
Mhm.
What's Trump doing? What's happening with ICE? What is he doing with I mean, just the astonishing amount of corrupt earnings that these families are booking while they're in power. So in a way, it's not surprising that how does this connect up with the money being sent from the Persian Gulf to our political leaders, as capital to float AI, to float Silicon Valley startups and stuff. That is, yes, of course, that's much harder. But so I guess my takeaway is for those of us who are really primed on this issue, there's a lot there's a lot more work to be done about about making this a salient public issue, because in fact it you really do have the US billionaires heavily at the moment against civic democracy in this country, and you have a Supreme Court that has really removed almost all limits on their ability to use their wealth to exercise political power in this country. And so that is work to be done, that that remains to be done, because I don't think that has become sufficiently politicized in the U.S. What the role of those people are, and how much they will, um, fight against efforts to kind of right things, and restore the rule of law, restore law and constitution at all in this country. So anyway, work to be done on that front. Um, and I think that's all we have for this episode. Anything else?
That's all. See you
All
next
right.
week.
See you next week.